The Virginia Democratic Party has risen on this wave of diversity since Mark Warner's election as governor in 2001, as has the National Party. The state organization has been regarded as one of the strongest in the nation of either party, due in part to the successful governorships of Mark Warner and Tim Kaine, both of whom are now in the U.S. Senate. At the national level, Virginia has voted Democrat in the last 3 presidential elections, after going Republican for 10 straight presidential elections previous to that. But suddenly Virginia Democrats are in disarray over allegations of racism against the current governor, and of their Attorney General, Mark Herring. Northam is resisting calls to resign for photos in his medical school yearbook showing one man in blackface and another in the white robes of the Ku Klux Klan. The governor initially said he was in the photo, then shortly after claimed he was not, but also admitted he had worn blackface in his mid-20s. Herring, who went to college at the University of Virginia, admitted to wearing blackface during those years. For decades in Virginia and across the South, casual racism such as wearing blackface provoked laughter rather than outrage. The Confederate flag was everywhere into the 1980s and early 1990s, according to one Virginia Republican operative with deep experience across multiple elections, who asked not to be identified. "You grow up here and this stuff is everywhere," the Virginia Republican said. "You still have all this furniture in the attic," and somebody opened the attic and said, "What is all this stuff?" "It's like, those are the chairs. They've always been here. This is our version of the Benz," he said. "We're rushing into modernity and it's gonna hurt." Since Gilmore, a Republican born and raised in Richmond, every Virginia governor but one has grown up in another state. The one governor who had spent much of his childhood in Virginia, Republican Bob McDonnell, was born in Philadelphia to a military family that traveled for part of his childhood and then spent the rest of it in the suburbs outside Washington, D.C. Northam, a 59-year-old Democrat, grew up on Virginia's rural eastern shore in a town that has never had more than 1,800 people. He is a product of the culture in much of Virginia outside the northern suburbs, whose history is built on slavery and has deep ties to white supremacy. The first men and women enslaved and brought to America arrived in Virginia, at Jamestown, exactly 400 years ago this August. The highest number of enslaved people were always in Virginia by a wide margin from 1790 to 1860, according to census data. When the Supreme Court ordered public schools to be racially integrated in 1954, Virginia lawmakers led by Senator Harry F. Byrd Sr. launched what became known as a massive resistance to mixing white and black children in taxpayer-funded schools. This resistance lasted through the 1950s and into the 60s. The Commonwealth is a far different state now. Since 2000, the white population in the state has dropped from 70% to 62%, while the Hispanic population has gone from 5% to 9% of the state, according to Hamilton Lombard at the University of Virginia's Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service. The foreign-born population in Virginia has risen from 8% to 13% over that same period, according to Lombard's data. Southern Virginia, meanwhile, has lost population over the past decade, Lombard said. Jobs are harder and harder to come by in those parts of the state, and so many younger people leave. The Democratic Party nationally, meanwhile, has become increasingly less tolerant of public figures' missteps on race or gender. Northam's response to the emergence of his yearbook photo provoked a massive backlash, which has only been blunted somewhat by the revelation that Herring, who is second in line for the governorship, also wore blackface as a young man, and by sexual assault allegations against Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax. Northam's bumbling response to the yearbook photo was indicative of his background in the Virginia of the Old South, but also of his lack of political experience. Northam was a U.S. Army officer and pediatric neurologist for much of his life and didn't enter politics until 2007, when he was elected to the state Senate. He won the lieutenant governor position in 2013 and his election as governor in 2017 was driven by an anti-Trump wave in the Commonwealth. During that campaign, it emerged that he had voted for Republican George W. Bush for president in 2000 and 2004. The shockwaves going through Virginia are an overdue accounting of the state's past at a time when Democrats are targeting institutional racism. It is one thing to codify equality into law, said Sean Kaine, a former Republican Party of Virginia executive director. It is something else for a white majority to precisely understand how our past legacy steals the intangibles, respect, dignity, and so forth.